welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man for whom the game has begun and a pawn has been moved.
Tim Longo.
Hello, sir. How are you
Hello.
today?
You got that email too, then.
I did. I also got that email. Well, we were, in fact, playing the same character, so we'll get to that at some point. We are starting a new series. I want to briefly cast back and thank Glenn Corpes again for joining us. That was a great interview.
Yes.
To close out our Populous discussion last week. Fantastic. If you have not had a chance to hear that yet, look it up. The interviews are always such a great time for us, and especially something like that where it's pretty foundational to a whole genre. It's like, well, I basically came up with the manipulation and all that stuff over the weekend, and then the bank holiday weekend or whatever he said, and then the whole game got built on top of it in 7 months. It's amazing how much games have changed. So
yeah, it was awesome to hear that. That very unexpected interview and story too, because we weren't planning on it, and it kind of just fell into our lap. So it was a nice surprise. Thank you, Glenn.
Yes. Thank you, Glenn. Moving on, we are starting as normal. This is the first episode of October, and we are doing our annual, horror or Halloween themed game. So this year we're tackling vampires. We decided on Vampire the Bloodlines, or Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, rather, I should say, which came out in 2004, which was one of those years. I was interviewed for Kotaku a while back on their podcast back when they still had one, and for Split Screen, and they asked, like, well, you started in '98 at LucasArts and left in 2004. And it was like, those are a couple of really good years. I happened to bookend with a couple of really good years. We have played some games from this year, or games in series that also had entries this year, and they'll kind of all come up. But here are some that are not related specifically to November, which I'll address separately. But here are some other games from the year. KOTOR 2, Doom 3, Fable, Sly 2. This is a great PS2 year, actually. Sly, for me in particular, because I love a lot of these games. Sly 2, Spider-Man 2, Ratchet & Clank, Jak 3. On the GameCube, there was also Pikmin 2 and Paper Mario, The Thousand-Year Door, which I know you never played, but you should have, especially considering I gave you a copy. Beyond Divinity, which was, I guess, maybe the second or third game from Larian Studios. I think the second in their Divine Divinity series, which, that's a studio to kind of keep an eye on for RPGs. Baldur's Gate 3 coming up soon. In case you want to think about how many months we want to set aside to play a Baldur's Gate game. And Medal of Honor Pacific Assault. That's kind of the year outside of this month, but November of 2004 might have been the stiffest competition month in video game history. I'm sure there have been some other doozies, but this particular month also saw a couple games close to your heart: EverQuest 2 and World of Warcraft. So there's some PC RPGs, even though they're multiplayer RPGs. In the same week, you had Half-Life 2. The week before, I believe you had Halo 2 and maybe Metroid Prime 2. I can't remember if it came out before or after. Metal Gear Solid 3, Snake Eater came out this month. And then a few others just to round it out. You had Counter-Strike, the Source version, which is basically the game that's still played today, although it has changed a bit over time. Legend of Zelda Minish Cap, Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, Bejeweled 2. That's a tough month. In history. So, especially when I think about the hours that you and I have poured into like World of Warcraft, it's hard to imagine going up against this. If we were not shipping a game this at this period, I can imagine a number of those would have been things I would have picked up this month, and this one probably would have slipped past me. It slipped past me anyway because we were finishing a game. So
yeah, for sure. And I think Warcraft also torpedoed pretty much anything else. I think even Half-Life 2 I ended up playing later,
me too.
Not in the year of, because of Warcraft and shipping and stuff. So yeah, I mean, Snake Eater, I mean, and you're just, and you hit all the main ones to mention, but there's quite a few others this year that you could mention as well, which I won't go into, but it's just like, you look at the list and it's pretty crazy. I mean, this was definitely a spike in the industry this year.
Right.
Which, I think we probably talked a little bit about when we did that bonus episode on Half-Life 2, but yeah, wow. Whew.
Yep. Quite a year. And Half-Life 2 is particularly interesting in this context because Half-Life 2 came out 1 or 2 days after Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. And it used the same engine, which is to say the source engine, which is speaking as a programmer, that's just astonishing to me that is even, like, you don't really want to be in that position, to be honest. Like it's a hard argument to make. I mean, I think at the time there was probably some expectation. I'm sure there's some, they're both West Coast developers. There was probably some sharing of information. Like there's probably some relationships maybe even that kind of made those sorts of things happen. I don't really know. Maybe we'll get some stories about that at some point, but that is not a thing that you want to have doing. I mean, we've spoken to, I remember at the time speaking to the Unreal folks at Epic and them being like, yeah, you don't want to be, the first game out on the engine. They were just frank about like, yeah, we're really building our game and that's what everything's going into, for engine development. And anything that doesn't serve that interest is going to be less important, right? I mean, just naturally. So any bugs that you have are kind of, sorry, they're not as important to us. They're just frank. There's only so much time, to deal with this. Yeah.
Well, and what's more is I would say that Valve wasn't known as Epic was known to actually have some amount of support and sort of customer service, if you will, in their business model. Valve really wasn't known for that and still isn't really, anyone can kind of technically use the source engine, but they don't have a sort of, support infrastructure at Valve. Even today, I don't think very much, even though like Respawn has used source most recently and stuff like that. So,
from the time, Epic is still the only one who actually actively supports their engine development as a separate engine. And has a business model around it. Yeah, exactly. They build around it. I mean, at the time, id was starting to get out of it already because it had grown to a point where it was getting complicated enough to support. They didn't have a separate dedicated team. They had done it before that, but it had been more like, sure, you can use it, pay us this much. But it was like a very, like, yeah, we'll take your money type arrangement. You won't get a lot for that support-wise. And I think Valve was probably kind of similar in that regard. That said, this would have been a company who was, although it had very good technical development for RPGs and things like that. We'll talk about that in a moment. They weren't really at a point where they could just sort of jump in and make a 3D engine. I mean, that's really a big thing to bite off for anyone. And that's why they tend to, well, that's why in some cases they get licensed, because it's a big endeavor to build one. There's not a lot of companies still doing it.
It's funny too to compare it, as we will probably talk about throughout the series, to compare it to Deus Ex in many ways. It's interesting that they went with Source versus Unreal, seeing that Deus Ex was done in Unreal, but there was probably business decisions. Who knows what decisions were made to have that happen. The other thing to consider for the timing, I don't know this. I don't remember this for sure, but I'm pretty sure that Half-Life 2 had at least one big delay. because
Right.
it's Valve, and Valve just kind of ships when they want to ship. And so part of the agreement might have been, or the understanding rather, not necessarily an official agreement, but part of the understanding with Troika might have been like, yeah, we're going to be shipping the year before you guys, so
Right.
you'll be fine,
There'll be plenty of time. Yeah.
And then it's like that did not happen, and I don't know, but there could have been some sadness when that was pushed, when Half-Life 2 was pushed. So that could have been part of the element too.
Right. And I can also imagine that this was also a big shakeup, right? Because Half-Life 2 did ship with Steam, right? As I recall.
Steam was happening.
In order to install to run Half-Life 2, you had to also install Steam. So Valve had a lot of technical eggs in the basket, really, to get out the door, to mix metaphors. So they just had a lot going on, and I can absolutely believe that they slipped. I mean, they've always been kind of a when it's done company anyway, and very they have a tendency to not make a lot of announcements about what's coming. They just, here's a thing today, kind of announcements, and that might be why we've never really seen them grow into a sort of engine licensing company in a more outward facing way. So
right,
just not their thing.
Right. Yep. So yeah, it's just a very, very interesting history. And I think to just hit, we'll probably come back to it as well throughout, but to hit Troika a little bit, for those who don't know, there's a couple different things to mention there. One is we had Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky on already for their work on Fallout, the first game, when they were at Interplay. They left Interplay to form Troika with
Jason
Anderson. Yep, with Jason Anderson, and they had done Temple of Elemental Evil. They had done Arcanum. Basically Fallout-ish, RPGs, which were isometric, in nature when it comes to the sort of design and camera and look of the game. And then I remember being surprised about Vampire because they did end up going full 3D with this one, which ended up being, I think, their last game, right? Troika's last game.
It was in fact their last game. And you mentioned Fallout already. The game that they were working on sort of as this was shipping to try to get funding to continue the company was Fallout 3. They were working on that and trying also to get the license back from Interplay, and a little studio called Bethesda bought the license, and they just outbid them.
It's crazy.
So that's my own personal tie there, because of course that's not only did I go and work on Fallout 3, but I actually hired on Skyrim the lead programmer from this game, who worked for me for a period of time towards Skyrim. So that may come up. Andrew Meggs was his name. He was the lead programmer. So I'm sure he has some stories. I know he has some stories, as it turns out. But yeah, Leonard was the creative director, I believe, and Jason Anderson was the project lead, which would maybe be sort of like a lead producer type role. I'm not sure exactly what those terms meant. Roles, what roles mean at different companies is often pretty varied. You mentioned Temple of Elemental Evil. Arcanum, I think, is pretty close. It's kind of a mix of the Fallout mold and then adding some sort of magic. Its subtitle is Of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, I believe.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like medieval Shadowrun, right? You've got magic and technology. The technology is steampunk.
It is the most steampunk you can, like. I remember being so excited about this game because I was such a big fan of theirs and of Fallout 1, and this was them breaking off doing this sort of fantasy, hybrid. And but I know I'm looking at it right now. I don't remember what engine they used though.
I think they wrote that one from scratch. Yeah, I think that they wrote from scratch. And then with Temple of Elemental Evil, to continue on, so Arcanum was sort of Fallout-y a little bit in terms of how the RPG worked. kind of a mix. Then Temple of Elemental Evil was really notable because it was the first full implementation of the D&D 3.5 rules. And that was like a huge deal. Although the game itself didn't do particularly well, wasn't reviewed particularly well. I think 70, 75 kind of Metacritic type number. Not that that's a meaningful thing. But it gives you a sense, whereas Arcanum, I think, was significantly higher, another 10 points higher, maybe. And it's notable because that is a straight implementation of a classic module from D&D, which already has some issues with it, because that's a great sort of super module, I think they ended up calling it, because it had actually been several modules that had kind of strung together. It is very oddly structured. It's not at all linear. And so they had a lot of design challenges, I think, to bring that, without having a DM in the game. I think it's really hard to do Temple of Elemental Evil. So I'm not sure that was the best marriage of form and content. Yeah,
I didn't finish it in video game form. It was...
I did, and it was tough.
Yeah. I remember it being
I definitely
difficult.
used some exploits at the end of just like, you know what, I can pause, I can save after everything, and just there was a point at which I was like, I have to make every roll at this point, so I will just save scum through this final battle. So,
well, yeah, and I did play Temple of Elemental Evil. I mean, we're off track now, but Temple of Elemental Evil as a module when it came out, though, as a young one. So I definitely was excited for them to work on this, for sure. But and then so I mean I'm kind of like refreshing my memory on these three. Let's see. Yep. So most recently, Tim and Leonard have, as we talked about, I think last time or sometime recently, we mentioned that they were alluding to a project that they were working on, which turned out to be the Outer Worlds. At Obsidian, Jason Anderson has been in exile for a while, worked on Wasteland 2, one of your favorites. And now, ironically, both Obsidian and In Exile have been purchased by Microsoft and are part of Xbox Game Studios. So technically, Jason, Leonard, and Tim
all working together again.
Back together again. So what a crazy... Oh, and he also, I think the Torment reboot was part... Oh, was he? I don't know if he was on that one. But anyway, so yeah, it's I think when we talked about Fallout and we talked to Tim maybe and Leonard, I feel like we talked a bit about the community, the Southern California community of RPG makers, down there, and right. Sort of how, basically sort of what, just like sort of LucasArts happened with LucasArts when people started breaking off and forming these studios that were all sort of co-located. Same thing happened to Interplay, in Obsidian, In Exile, Brian Fargo we talked about as well. And so I hope we get him on someday. Hopefully we will talk about something, Bard's Tale, maybe, if we ever do that one. But yeah, so just a funny history to get us to Vampire. And sort of, the Outer Worlds was I haven't played it yet, but was well received. Did well. Seems like, to be honest, like a modern version of this crossed with Fallout, sci-fi though.
Right. Yep.
But structurally, there's a lot of the similarities. So seems like, so anyway, still alive and well, this type of game. So Vampire.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and so I guess we should, since we kind of touched on D&D and the 3.5, we should talk about the license here, which is, so they basically tried first, their own thing. They made up Arcanum entirely. That wasn't based on any existing system or what have you, or license. They went full in on Temple of Elemental Evil as a license with D&D, and had some challenges because it was a pretty non-linear module to begin with. It was originally it was the village of Hamlet, which goes back to my very early days of playing D&D. It's the sort of thing that when I started playing D&D, I would have not even understood what to do. And then this is now White Wolf, which is a different style, for those who who aren't aware, it's kind of a different style of role-playing game from D&D. It's a little less systems heavy. Maybe you could kind of talk about, and we'll talk about how that influences the game, but you're somebody who's actually played actual White Wolf RPGs. I've only ever played licensed card games and licensed material. So
yeah, I mean, it's what Brett's getting to is it's basically way more role play centric. The mechanical aspects of the game are much more simplified, and the sort of like statistical elements of the game are sort of de-emphasized, I guess I would say. You have stats, and you have, the equivalents of similar equivalent to what you have in D&D, that so many games have, essentially, so RPG games have ripped off over the years. But I think one of the things I always respected about White Wolf as a pen and paper is that they very intentionally went in a different direction, right? They weren't a offshoot of the D&D formula, and I think the other thing that I always liked about it was that the setting, I think it is a well-designed system for when it comes to combining the gameplay of the tabletop with the world. And what I mean by that is a very melodramatic world, as I think we'll talk about a lot in this series. And the melodrama of that world fits well with a RPG heavy system. Do you know what I mean? There is combat, and there are sort of, moments where you need to do skill check type things. But at least what the GM that I played with, who is a friend of, I don't know if you knew John too much or not, but John Stafford.
We never worked on anything, but I certainly knew John, and we hung out just through knowing you.
Yeah, and he's actually a narrative director at Crystal Dynamics right now, and he worked at LucasArts for many years. But anyway, he was my GM, and he was a very good GM when it comes to the role playing part of it. I think that's really, he's a storyteller now, right? He's a writer and storyteller now, and that was really just his sort of bread and butter. So, and he's a very outward going guy, and and so it's a system that really rewards that. You don't need to do it that way, but it really is an RPG or RP kind of centric game. So there's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of intrigue, a lot of politics, a lot of diplomacy. Those sorts of words are used, right, versus swordplay and and guns. And there are those, but like, even to give you an example, even the dice construction of the mechanics is simplified because you only use 10-sided dice or die, and it's just how many do you have kind of thing. So it's a little bit similar to the Cthulhu game where that only uses 6-sided dice. And so so they kind of found ways to streamline some of that stuff with the goal of focusing on role playing. So I think I'll turn it back over to you, because I know the point you're trying to make when it comes to this game we're playing and how that changes things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so in to elaborate a little bit, I mean, we've been playing some D&D 3rd edition. A couple big things about this, so that kind of come to mind from the pen and paper world, is this was also the year that White Wolf ended their world. Like all of the RPGs.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah,
were ended in 2004. I think towards the beginning of the year, I think. So it's kind of also an interesting time to be doing this. I remember it was a big, bold thing at the time. Like, I didn't play the game myself, but I was like, I couldn't believe the guts to say, yes, the world of not only vampire but also werewolf, mage. Was there something called Wraith? Something like that?
Wraith, mummy.
All these sort of classic, Hollywood monster types. It all just ended. It was just like, and then the apocalypse happened, and the world ended, and that was this year.
Which, and they always did a good job at world building. I mean, world building was really their bread and butter. And I'm not saying that isn't the case, obviously, with D&D, but I think D&D. I would say D&D they have their campaign settings, but they allow for a lot more flexibility and variety. But, White Wolf doubles down on the fact that this is a modern setting. and that it's, quote unquote, happening right now around us. And, the old stories of Gygax and all of his contemporaries, wanting to make a game where they could role play out and play Lord of the Rings, right, was as being sort of one of the main inspirations. Like they want to relive those, but as their own characters. White Wolf obviously was trying to achieve that same goal, but from an Anne Rice novel, or sort of the intrigue and the romance and the sort of conspiracy theories and the whole concept that vampires would live among us. That's the whole, as you'll see from the series, and if you haven't played the game. But yeah, they did a good job with the real world timeline as well, to make big sort of setting changes about things, which isn't as much the goal for Wizards.
Yeah, D&D has not ever really been that way. It has, in fact, they are kind of famous for having any number of sort of campaign settings just not really work out. I mean, there are people who like them and everything, but they don't get as much support because they often try on a few. I mean, I can remember like Dark Sun, and
Eberron. I feel like
Eberron was one that didn't really. It
was
fly.
Okay, yeah. The related to this though is a point that I'll make later. I'll just plant the seed now, and I think we'll talk about it throughout the series as well. But the funny thing about it is, and I don't know if this is just me being me and what I am interested in and being the nerd that I am, but for whatever reason, I fear that, and maybe one of the reasons why I fell off of White Wolf games in general is I feel like they are not as timeless, because I think they were developed in a time when a certain sort of aesthetic was popular, and it was modern. And I feel like I haven't played them recently, so maybe they have evolved with the time. I don't know what playing White Wolf today is like, but I feel like there's just a style of this sort of like that era, the 90s and aughts, were that sort of that melodramatic sort of like, vampires were big, and they still kind of are in some ways, but I'm not really talking about like Twilight per se, right. But though I guess you could, if a Twilight fan could definitely play Vampire the Masquerade and feel like they're playing, they're living the life of Twilight. I'm sure. I bet you there's even rules for that. But I don't know. For me, I just worry that, D&D for whatever reason is timeless, and because it's not our world or something, it's like, a galaxy far, far away or something. Middle Earth, same thing. And I just fear that it's just not feeling as timeless to me as I thought it would so far.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and it is definitely very specifically dated. It also, and we'll get into this, but it definitely feels like it's drawing from particular classes of society that don't necessarily feel heroic. Obviously, you're playing a vampire, so how heroic can you really be? There is this sort of like, I don't know, edgy aspect that we talked a little bit about in pre-show, and we'll come back around.
It's got an attitude, that I recognize, but I feel, and maybe it's just because the game is in 2004, but to be honest, that's not that really, in the grand scheme of things, that's not that long ago. So
that's
it's
only
like
6,000 years ago, as far as I can tell, the way I've been feeling lately. So it's practically yesterday.
Fair enough.
No, but I take your point. Like a lot of our sort of cultural touchstones are very similar. It's like a lot of our music is the same. A lot of our fashion is the same. It doesn't, like 2004 does not feel as distant from now as 1988 did to 2004.
Yeah, right. And obviously, as soon as you set something like this in modern day setting, then that's going to immediately, if you don't age it as you go. So it's actually now making me think I should look up some White Wolf stuff and see what's going on with that thing right now. Because I know they actually, as a company, had some ups and downs business-wise. I don't think they're anywhere near as strong anymore as they were, and definitely not as strong as Wizards. So Anyway, and then I'm also looking at their site, and should have said something up top when you asked me to explain them. Really, the way that White Wolf describes their systems is their storytelling systems. They're not RPG systems. Yeah. It is all about the storytelling.
In fact, I think it was called the Storyteller System at the time, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, it's literally built around that more so than anything else. I mean, I can remember at the time hearing that, probably from you, that you might have the most important thing that might happen in a session of Vampire might be a conversation, like that you might literally have a conversation which just changes everything, right? It's just dramatic, right? Which is very different from D&D, where the biggest thing that happens is probably the fact that so-and-so went to -10 twice in the session and had to be revived by the cleric both times. Not that I've ever seen that happen, ever.
Yeah. Like 2 days ago.
But yeah, it does it, and it makes it funny because in this game in particular, I've already noticed that the rewards around experience points are much more tied to story and much less tied to specifically how you approach that, which actually makes it marry pretty well with something like Deus Ex. You don't really have to balance out, like, how important is it that you snuck past these guards versus you killed them or whatever and got so many points. You're just going to tie that to achieving mission goals. And I think that that's pretty interesting in and of itself. Like, I like that. That's actually a pretty good model. I think that's part of the problem with trying to do the games where you can do so many different sorts of things is that balancing problem, which, a DM, in the tabletop setting is going to go and say, well, you know what, I want to kind of keep everybody together, and they're going to like just fudge the numbers and give everybody some number of points. And it's fine. Like, it just works out. Whereas here, in any computer game, you sort of like, you have to, if people are going to do multiple approaches to a thing, just for balancing reasons, you have to figure out how that's all going to work out so that everybody kind of gets to the same place. And having it tied to story beats is a big part of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think to your point about like what is a session of Vampire, what are the big spikes or moments, in a session of Vampire, the pen and paper, when there was combat, it often, at least the way that John would run things, it would often be fairly cinematic focused, right, rather than mechanical. Do you know what I mean? And what I mean by that is like, the Matrix had not been out for very long, so that was probably a bit of our influence. And so a gunfight would probably in our heads look a lot like a scene in the Matrix, and it's a big spike in action, but then it's kind of over and done, right? And then you're just back to the sort of intrigue is the word I keep coming back to, and the mystery of it all. Yep. But you definitely would have a session with no combat, multiple sessions. But then when you do, it ends up kind of being this movie scene, or maybe, maybe there's a melee combat scene as well, but they're fairly short lived. And the concept of fighting a dragon is not a thing. You know what I mean? It's you're fighting definitely all of the different types of creatures and entities in the world are, fantastical. There's werewolves and stuff, but it's not like on the scale, I think I would say, of sort of like the fantasy that you have in a D&D sort of setting. We actually ended up we did play Vampire, I believe, at least one adventure or so, but John's campaign was actually in the mage setting.
Game. Okay.
Yeah, where you're basically
I might be crossing it with Ray Gresco, because I think he and I also talked about it at the time, because I was unfamiliar with I had played the card game adaptation by I think Richard Garfield had done that as well from Wizards.
Yeah, I played that too. Yeah,
and which was originally called Jihad, and then they renamed it because White Wolf didn't think it would take off, and then Magic exploded, and they were like, you know what, you can call it Vampire, it's okay. So they called it Vampire the Masquerade. And I can remember having games where it was a really interestingly made game where the game could end up being entirely about votes that the political vampire
very political
guy would play a series of votes, and because he had all these points, because he had all these, I don't know, princes or whatever, would end up just okay, I'll take a vote to do this, and so all these things happen to you that are bad, and then I'll take a vote to do this, and then just like all the characters would die. It had a great structure. I love that game, but it took too many people to play. It was tough to get groups together, I think. Anyway, so all of that is to say, I agree. It's interesting, and with all of this, it just makes for a weird mix for this game to be kind of coming out against.
It's a weird mix, especially when as we get into the series more and we start talking about certain systems, like for instance, melee combat, which they're trying to make an action game out of, but because of the type of game it is, which I would actually consider, we probably talked about with Deus Ex as well, it's a sum of parts kind of approach. And when you do that, none of the actual individual systems are going to shine, if you look at them on their own. And I think that's very clear with the melee system and the ranged combat system. I did want to quickly clarify for those White Wolf players out there that are probably yelling at me right now. They did do rulebook supplements that took vampire, werewolf, mage, all of them into different eras. So they had Dark Ages.
Oh, right. Yes. Mm-hmm.
The Wild West werewolf,
Right. Yeah. I remember that being a thing too.
Victorian age. So just so people know, it wasn't all modern. They did dabble with some of that stuff, but really as a franchise, it's most associated with modern day.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Their bread and butter was that. And, just like D&D campaigns, their kind of mainline settings tend to be Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms, are the ones that last. With White Wolf, it was the modern as well. I mean, God, I even think about something like Shadowrun, and that even feels a little bit more timeless to me. First of all, because it is slightly futuristic, or it was at the time that it came out in the, I don't know, late 80s. Or early 90s, whatever it was when that first source book came out, because it was cyberpunk plus magic, right? And elves and trolls and what have you, dwarves, so it was like its own thing as well. And that's had a number of PC games in the last decade, as well. It's a lot more kind of in the D&D style. It's a little simpler and mechanically, I think, as well, but also has that, like, I don't know. There's something about that world that feels a little more timeless in that way. So Anyway.
Also, just to mention it too, there was going to be a a World of Darkness online that CCP was going to be doing. Right. Remember that?
Yeah.
They eventually canceled,
and at some point CCP bought White Wolf, or White Wolf bought
that's
CCP.
What I mean. Yeah, that's what I mean. There was
a
weird
whole huge mess around all of that. God, I forgot about that.
Weird company stuff going on there. So, and I actually didn't know this. There was a Werewolf I remember that game, 2017, that Cyanide did, which I just played their Cthulhu game.
Yeah, there was supposed to be a werewolf game that was going to launch on the 360 as well, I think.
I think that might have been.
Maybe it was original Xbox. No, this is an old one.
Okay.
It never came out. I remember I was super excited for it, and I was like, oh, that's super cool. Nobody had really done a werewolf game. I don't know that there's been a lot of werewolf games. Send me mail, because can't remember any really sort of AAA, like, play as a werewolf games. So it was super exciting to me. They're going to transform back and forth. Anyway. Yeah, let's get in. Now we're 40 minutes in. Let's get into the game proper. Let's talk about character creation and your embrace. We'll get, I guess, to the actual embrace scene, because character creation happens first, and then you go into the game. So so it's an interesting choice for character creation. It's funny because it tries to. It's one thing I actually appreciated about how this game opens, is that it feels like it's trying to, I think because it's an action game in part, it's a 3D first-person game, a first and third-person game. It's trying to take sort of that, the action adventure players and say, hey, you can either go full RPG with this and just look at the character sheet, or you can get this more Ultima style series of questions that you'll answer, and we'll just pick a character for you. We'll design a character around your answers, which I thought was great. So of course I went that way because I was an old school Ultima player, and so did you.
Yeah. And to be honest, like I should have thought that you would go that direction because of your Ultima past. But I was actually thinking in my head that I was going to buck the trend because I would never. That's not me. I'd never do
right,
that.
Exactly.
I would go the so to myself, I'm like, I'm going to go the opposite direction that I would normally go and just take what I get and see what happens. Because I kind of do know the system somewhat. So, I would have kind of already had a preconceived notion of what I wanted to play. So I'll let the game decide. But then, yeah.
Yeah, so Ultima style, just for those who don't know, the old Ultima games, you would, and this especially...
It's like a personality test.
Yeah, it's like they ask you a series of questions. In Ultima, it's basically trading off, do you think justice is more important than honesty or... humility or whatever, and they ask you these questions that are binary, but picking between the sort of eight major traits or whatever they are, in that game. This game's a little bit more complicated. There's more questions. So the first few questions are: an ex-roommate stole your stuff and left you with a stack of bills. So what did you do? And it's like, did you bash their head? When you see him in a bar, do you bash his head against the bar? Do you like poison his drink or, put drugs in his drink or something like that? So you have like these options of what you're going to do. The second question was, you're outbid at an auction for a piece of art that you just have to have. So what do you do? And give you options. The amazing thing about this is I just kind of picked a vibe. Like I'm going to sort of think of a character in my mind, like not a specific vampire.
Because you're not.
I'm not familiar. Like there was a TV show at the same time as this, and I saw that, so I have some like I know, and I do love vampire stuff, so I do just kind of have an idea of what they might be.
Yeah.
I loved What We Do in the Shadows, for example, and it's like that movie's hilarious because it's got like specific vampire types that you're like, oh yeah, that's this vampire, that's that vampire,
yeah.
and this game has those as well. There's more of them than I tend to think of, or that I would come up with on my own, I guess. But
in this process, if you start off and you don't know the clans, you're going to start and you do it in the Ultima way. You have no idea what
I have no idea where
the options are.
Yeah. I didn't know where I was going to end up. Like I remember there's one that's very much into the animal stuff. It's the Bruma.
Well, there's the Grendel, I think, are the ones that kind of look like gangly, like they're more werewolfy. And then the Bruja are the big hulking,
right? The hulks,
ones. Yeah.
Anyway, so like I could remember some of it. I knew that there's like the artsy ones, and there's the royalty, the princes that are the political ones. And I'm like, but I was like, you know what? I'm going to kind of pick a thuggy female character. So I kind of answered in that vibe as I did it. Like I picked female and then answered all these questions, kind of like little skullduggery, little like, and the funny thing is that so did Tim.
Yep. As in pre-show, we were kind of like talking through, and I think we were both kind of trying to not say so we could talk about it on the podcast. And then it kind of dawned on us, like, wait a second, what'd you pick, or what'd you get? And oh no.
Go ahead.
So what I was going to say is I did a similar thing when it comes to sort of like picking a persona. And I guess if I were to summarize it, I was kind of trying to go stealthy. And like a little bit more in the shadows, which makes sense now, I guess, to some degree. So what did we both get?
We both ended up as Nosferatu, which are vampires who look like the Nosferatu in that movie from 19 whatever.
They're monstrous.
2027 or something like that. That's a great movie, by the way. People who are looking for movies to watch this month, totally recommend it. It holds up. Very scary still. Count Orloff. But yeah, they are the ones that have the long pointy ears. They're often bald. Their teeth are, they have fangs, but they also just have super long teeth all over the place. They look dead. Right, they look like they smell bad because
they look like monsters. Yeah,
they look monstrous, and it's pretty funny because in your scene of being embraced, you start off as a very human-looking person, right? I picked a woman, and so did you, which is also funny, and you're like being seduced basically by the vampire who turns you into a vampire. You don't see any of this. There's just kind of like, audio. You see like some discarded clothing or something like that. And then
condoms.
And condoms, tons of condom wrappers.
Definitely
a ridiculous number of condom wrappers. You're like, come on.
They're definitely going for a full M adult. We'll talk about that throughout too, but like they're trying to be edgy with this.
Yeah, they're not holding back on that stuff. Yeah, that was actually very.
Which funny. I don't know why vampires don't need anyway.
Well, yeah, there's that. Well, yeah, but presumably the woman does. I mean, and vampires are also like. They are, yeah, I mean, we'll get into this, I guess, at some point. But vampires also just historically are sort of an analogy, for disease, right? And so that makes sense. That's one of the things you can read into vampires. This might be partly why they started coming back in the late 80s, early 90s, as we had a blood disease, going throughout the world. Who knows, really? I'm not a cultural historian, but that it tracks, right? I mean, it's right. Anne Rice became super popular basically in the early and mid 80s. At the same time, we started having the HIV breakout. So yeah, we ended up with the same characters. I'm actually going to restart so I can play something different. So we have something to discuss as far as that goes going forward. Because in an RPG that's so much about choices, I think it's going to be important to talk about those sorts of things. But basically, other vampires break in. You don't know this. You've just been embraced and made a vampire. You don't even know, I think, that you're a vampire yet. They stake you, which in this universe doesn't turn you to instant dust like it does in others. I guess it
more
paralyzes
of a stun.
you.
Yeah.
It means you can't move. You're basically you're stuck, and they move you to somewhere else. And that's when you get the big world building moment of one of the princes. What are they? They're not the Camarilla is all the vampires. What are the? He's the prince of the Camarilla. The new. Oh, he's apparently a new.
The
prince. Camarilla are the political ones, right? Okay.
Yeah, and they're kind of, I forget exactly how it works, but the structure of it. But the Camarilla are kind of like the governing body or something. You know what I mean? Like they're the loyalty or something of the arbiters. And we later see the Sabbat as the sort of counter to them. But anyway, yeah.
And they pull out the stakes, and you get to actually see your character for the first time. And I knew kind of what I was going to get based on what I had read.
Geez.
And then I was like, oh my God, that's actually a lot uglier than even I expected.
Yeah.
Our character is quite hideous. It's pretty funny. And they clearly they tell you you can't be seen. Human beings will shun you. You will be seen as a monster, which I have
a story about.
Yeah, you can tie that into in a moment. Yeah, and I guess we can go straight into those things. But that's basically what happens there. I guess there are representatives of all the different types.
You're in a theater, right? So it's like you're in a I guess it's a stage theater of some kind, and then and then your sire for what do they call it? Turning? No, the embrace. The embrace. They embraced without permission from the prince, and so he was beheaded in front of everybody. But the part of the world building that Brett's talking about is they show the camera cuts around to the audience of the theater, and it basically represents all the different clans and presumably characters we will meet. And the thing that dawned on me during that section is, I'm coming in with some amount of knowledge about the world, but they're trying to pack in a lot in that beginning, and of course they're not expecting you to understand who everyone is at that point, but there is a lot of players, you know what I mean? You see this guy up on the balcony who has, I think, these red round glasses, and he's shaved head and stuff. And you're like, who's that? So everyone, I think, is meant to at least make a little bit of an impression, but taking this on as a game, this world on, and trying to present it because White Wolf's pretty big, but it's generally still a niche franchise, and so a lot of people playing may not know much about White Wolf stuff, and so you kind of got to come into it as a developer.
I mean, it's telling that the big breakout RPG that people watch live streamed is D&D, right? I mean, it's Critical Role. I mean, we watch Dungeon Run, but it's mostly Dungeons and Dragons when you think about live streamed role playing games these days. Those are the ones that have really hit. I mean, I'm sure there are people playing literally everything, Monster World, and I mean all of that. I'm sure all of it is getting play online. But when you think about the things that get millions of views, it has been D&D.
Yeah. So. It's still baffling. I mean, to some degree, for me, it's still baffling that that's true, but it is true. I mean, it is we don't need to talk about D&D, but it's pretty timeless. But my point is, you have to, it is a very rich world with a lot of rules and a lot of key players and factions and stuff. And to introduce, that I can just see, I can feel what they probably felt when it comes to, okay, how do we introduce a new player to this situation, and all the different things. What do we choose to focus on first and then later? And so we'll see as it unfolds, but it's fascinating. And by the way, as an aside, Nosferatu would have been the last clan I would have chosen.
Yeah, me too.
Yep. So it's like, and I kind of was approaching it.
It feels like a degree of difficulty problem for me. It's like, well, I already don't know a lot about this world, and I would not have picked it just because I would have known that it adds on this aspect of being hideous and like nobody wanting to speak to you. Like you're not going to be able to talk your way out of situations in this game, it seems.
Yeah. I'm fearful, of that approach for me. And I'm kind of, to be honest, it harkens back a little bit to our very first series with System Shock 2, where I very intentionally played in a direction that I wouldn't normally play. And for those listeners who've listened to the show a lot, they know that I'm for the podcast, if we're playing something I've either played before or a genre that I really like, for the podcast, I try to do something against my own type, And so when Nosferatu came up, I thought, well, this is definitely not what I would have chosen, but for the podcast, it'll probably be interesting. And there's no way Brett would go Nosferatu. So it'll be, and I am worried about sort of the mechanical and systemic aspects of playing a Nosferatu, which I'm already seeing, I think, in some of the early things I've been dabbling with. So it's going to be weird. I feel like it might end up being, I mean, here's a prediction, not knowing, but I'll predict it now in the first episode. I feel like it might feel like a different game to me if I stick with Nosferatu than if you go with another, so that maybe that's why it's kind of a cult classic, because it can have such a diverse, experience based on who you play.
Definitely looking into it. I've read a lot about how there are people who just like will play it, every major unofficial patch, like what else has been added or recovered or, whatever, et cetera. So it's, it's one of those games that definitely has a devoted following, and has continued to sell. I will say, I think the most horrifying thing to come out of this October season is how alike you and I are becoming, apparently, in our old age. So that's something that I will have trouble sleeping tonight, I'm sure.
Right. Yep. We both answered all the same questions.
It's terrifying.
Never having designed one of those question and answer systems for selecting classes. I'm always intrigued about how you construct one of those and why the flow chart comes out the way it does, because some of my answers I can kind of see how it ends up in Nosferatu, but not all of them. So it's very interesting. I'd love to see.
Yeah, I think they probably do something similar. So the way it works in Ultima is they're basically just it's just it must be 7 questions. They're basically trying to you pick whichever one you prefer out of these, out of any the 4 introductory pair offs that they make. It's just a tournament to determine what comes out on top, because there is one class for each of the 8 attributes in Ultima. Yeah, so it's very simple. It's literally just like, if you end up with whatever, empathy is, I don't know what they are. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but justice as the most important thing, you become a paladin, period, or whatever.
Yeah.
And, it's literally just that. Here, I suspect what they do is they ask questions and like put point. It's probably more of a point buy game. It's like, well, this answer puts points into these things. And then whichever one comes on top would be my guess. And then they just have 9 designed characters to start with. 18, but I think that stats wise, there's probably just a gender swap. That would be my guess. That's how I would do it based on how many. There were a lot more questions than I expected, so it's not clearly like just a straight tournament, or something like that.
Well, and the questions had they had more subtlety to some of them than I would have thought too. So it's like. I remember one.
They also had multiple answers. I mean, not just binary. It was like 3 answers off it.
Yeah, 3 answers. Like for instance, the movie one. Like which movie do you watch tonight? There was like a kung fu wire kung fu, like a samurai, and then like maybe a mafia or like crime.
See, and here's the interesting thing that makes me that reinforces my theory. I didn't get that question.
Oh, okay.
So I had already pushed. Well, I had probably already pushed more clearly into Nosferatu maybe than you had, or maybe I hadn't. Maybe I got different questions as a result of that. Yeah. So because I know looking at my first few answers, the first question, which was the roommate who stole my stuff, I bashed his head into the bar. Which is maybe not how the Nosferatu would do it. I was outbid in an auction. I made it look like a robbery, and then intruder broke into my house. I overpowered them and wrestled them to the ground, breaking as many bones as possible. Like, so I actually was kind of surprised I ended up with Nosferatu because I thought I might end up with like the Bruja, or
that's the funny thing, because I don't think I answered those. I didn't have the same answers for those questions.
Now I'm wondering if I do it again, if I'm going to end up a Nosferatu again. No, I don't think I will, because you can pick the other ones, right? You could just in character creation literally just pick be something different.
Right. Yeah.
I think actually, we should probably talk about the tutorial.
Yeah,
let's talk about the tutorial. I wanted to briefly just talk about what the character sheet looks like, just so people know how points are being spent.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty traditional looking thing. You have attributes and abilities that I think there's basically 3 categories of each, and each has 4 sub domains, let's say, to pick a word. So you have physical, social, and mental attributes. Each of those have a breakdown of, maybe it's only 3 for the attributes. I can't remember if it's 3 or 4.
I don't remember.
I think it might be 3. And then there's abilities, which break down into talents, skills, and knowledges, which is a weird word, but knowledge. And then based on the combination of those, you get feats, which are basically things you can do in the world. So lockpicking is not a talent, skill, or knowledge. It is derived from your security skill and your physical dexterity to pick a feat, a thing that you can do in the world, an actual action. There's seduction, which comes from your appearance, which is a social attribute. And then I forget what the thing is what the actual talent it is that multiplies into that, because as a Nosferatu, we have 0 appearance. Can't ever be better. So I didn't remark upon what that was. You also have some disciplines, which are basically where your magic. You have some vampire magic. For us, that's animalism, obfuscate, which is clouding minds, basically supporting the stealth, and potence, which is to toughen you up. So yeah, and there's also, I think there's one thing that all vampires can do, blood something. So
yeah, blood charm, no blood, I forget.
Yeah, blood build, blood something. Yeah.
It's interesting too, because I'm refreshing my memory on the traditional vampire character sheet, and It's the feats system was interesting to me, the way that they implemented here, because I don't remember, and I'm looking at the sheet. I don't think that's a thing for the pen and paper. The way that the feats are derived from two other, an attribute,
two other things, multiplying them together or whatever.
Yeah, basically having them be connected. I think that's kind of a neat way to implement that. So there's not maybe as many sort of overwhelming choices to make when you're leveling up or what have you. But then in the pen and paper, I don't think there is even such a thing as feats. I think it's just attributes, abilities, and then you have advantages, which are disciplines and backgrounds. But that's more of the role-playing stuff, I think. Well, disciplines are the powers that you've chosen, but I guess. But anyway, the abilities are kind of like skills, talents, and knowledges are all just in one big group. There's not like a feats sort of. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and then the final thing I just want to point out is that those experience points that you get very few of them. It's not like D&D where it's like thousands between level 1 and 2. It's like 1,000 to 1 or 1,000 to level 2, and then etc. Those numbers have changed over time. They're really weird in 5, by the way. We'll talk about that, you and I, at some point, because there's no obvious algorithm.
What are you talking about? Experience
in fifth edition with experience points, but in this game there's very few. It's like 1, 2, or 3, and then you literally just spend them to improve values. So it's like
weird. Yeah, it's what you would traditionally just call a skill point, but
they're
both the same.
They're skill points, and they're not. They also don't have a specific progression. Like, I think a lot of the skills, for example, are 3 to start having it, to buy into it at all. And then the next level might be 3, and then it's 6. Whereas increasing your dexterity or something is more expensive. It's like 5 to go from first to second. And because those multiply into the feats, I sort of understand that's kind of the balancing game they're doing of like, well, this thing applies to multiple feats, because it's a core attribute, so maybe we want to make those more expensive, etc. And then things get more expensive as you go on as well. So if you really want to be the most dexterous, that's going to really cost you. So in terms of those, story point, mission point, quest, finishing quest type things are just going to give you a few points, and that's it doesn't seem like much, but the way this thing is laid out, I can see it being that. You're also, I don't think, going to be the person who is everything, which is not true of a lot of action games. If you play a Ubisoft style game like a modern Far Cry, they have skill trees, or
Assassins.
Horizon Zero Dawn was the one I was going to say. The Assassin's Creed are similar. Yeah, they all have like these skill trees, but it's like if you just keep playing, ultimately you'll have everything. It's really just the order in which you want to take to get things. Here, I think you're not going to get everything. In particular, as a Nosferatu, you certainly can't, because your appearance can never be better than 0. So let's go to the tutorial, and then we'll finish out. So
yeah, I mean,
take me into it.
Yeah, I think so. Once you leave the theater after that scene, obviously you've just been introduced as a player, and I mean, as a Nosferatu, which both of us experienced at least, so that's interesting to talk about. You see your character and you're like, what am I? If you didn't know what you were looking at, it's like you're at this theater with all these other characters who are human looking, and then you're not, other than the Bruja, which are really, more hulking. But anyway, basically the prince takes you under his wing, because your sire was just killed, and says, you're my responsibility now. I'm going to send you away to learn, because as a player and as a character, you're now having to learn what it is to be a vampire and what is going on with the vampire world. And so you're introduced to this character, Jack, who I love the voice actor for, and is immediately, I think, is a good example of the sort of style and richness that they're trying to put into the narrative of the game. And the vampire clans in general are fairly stereotype based. They kind of fall into, like Brett said earlier, sort of vampire tropes, if you will. and so he's kind of the biker. I don't know how you describe him, but kind of the biker kind of vampire, and kind of gruff. But he basically is your narrator through the tutorial, and so you're leaving the theater kind of in the adjacent building or maybe in the same building, and kind of going through the alleyways, and you're basically just learning. The cool thing about the tutorial for me, other than just learning the basics of like melee combat or stealth or gunplay or something like that, is that he's also, I think he's pretty well written for the style of the game, in that he's got a lot of character within him, and he's also throwing in little breadcrumbs about the world itself and what it is to be a vampire. He's talking about the Sabbat, who are immediately attack the theater gathering, because they obviously, all of the clan leaders are there, and so they're wanting to take them out or something. And the Sabbat are basically like a chaotic enemy sort of vampire faction to the Camarilla. And so
yeah, they're basically they're the ultra libertarians of the vampire world. Like the Camarilla want to say, hey, we've got to set down some rules so that we can live in human society and all prosper.
The Masquerade.
They reinforce the Masquerade, which is like, we can live alongside humans. We need to never let them know we're here. And the Sabbat are like, no, man, we don't need no masks. So
yeah, they're the rebels, right? They're libertarians, rebels, whatever, revolutionary. They're trying to fight the man or whatever, but as vampires. So fight breaks out, so it ends up giving you a good reason to take out some enemies and stuff. And so, but Jack is kind of narrating some of that as you go, right? Of like, that's the Sabbat, that's what they're all about. Hey, and then he teaches you, most importantly, how to feed, because you come out obviously with at the theater scene with less blood than you should have, and so you feed on a guy looking for his car, a drunk guy, and and they just kind of like trickle down all the little mechanics like feeding, crouching. They introduce concepts like the computer, which ends up being a pretty big thing, it seems like. So you can hack into computers and stuff. Keys and doors, all the basics.
Yep.
But I think Jack is sort of the main thing to mention there, is that they had a good hook there on trying to give you somebody to focus on, and who clearly has, I forget which clan he would be a member.
He's Bruja.
Is he? Okay.
Yeah, he's kind of wild. He's kind of outside of society. He's got kind of a Lobo look to him. He's Lobo. I mean the comic book character. I almost said cartoon. Oh my god, the email. The comic book character, like, he's got that kind of look. He's got, he definitely feels a little wolfish to me. So yeah, he's Bruja, which is the animal aligned. I don't know how else you would say it. He's also Hispanic, so he's sort of that Hispanic vampire. Like, he would be played in the film version by Danny Trejo. It would be a Bruja.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, totally get that. It's super interesting thinking about that character. But anyway, yeah. So yeah, he wears like a leather vest, and he's very well characterized, and they're doing a ton of exposition, but it is pretty well written exposition, I have to say. It's not a huge lore dump, because you know how much I love those.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I feel like
it's really well kind of teased out. It's like it's telling you a lot of information, but not in a way that doesn't feel pretty natural. It's very strong that way.
Yeah, it doesn't feel forced, and it's just peppered in there, which I think is nice. And Smiling Jack, I guess, is his full name.
Yep.
And it sounds like we'll meet him again because he's at the bar. But yeah, So I mean, as far as like getting into the details, I think it's pretty obvious some of the stuff that you'll learn in the you are introduced to the melee combat system, which is there's a lot more going on there than I would have thought. You actually go to third person, and there's apparently combo-ish kind of stuff. The combo that the one I mean. And
send your email to.
which I'm just surprised to see. There's a little bit of subtlety to the gunplay, but that looks like probably the least implemented sort of combat. And then you learn your powers, right? Because each, which man, doing one of these for each clan, I'm sure is just a load of fun, because the tutorial definitely had specific scenarios.
Right. Here's a room. You're going to go into this room, right? And you're going to have to get through it.
Obfuscation and stuff like that. So, yeah. Yep. So,
hey, you need to distract this guy. Use your night whatever thing. So you have some special ability to actually do that.
Animalism.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So, it was fine. I mean, as far as the tutorial goes, other than I think Smiling Jack, it was pretty traditional. But then you end up, I think the prince does tell you to go to Santa Monica to meet Mercutio, and so
actually he just says I think he just says I've given you an apartment, and then in the apartment is like maybe Mercurio is mentioned before that.
I thought
Mercutio? Yeah, maybe he is.
It might be Mercurio. Yeah,
But yeah, and the tutorialization kind of lightly continues into there. Like with Smile and Jack, there's sort of like a lot of world buildy stuff, and like, hey, yeah, there are these guys, and like, here are your powers. Here's the things that you can do. When you actually get into your apartment, it sort of lightly continues that in a more passive way with like, there's some notes around. There's a refrigerator that has a blood pack in it. So it's like teaching you the, like this is a game where you also want to open drawers. Like you want to walk around and look at things and see if you can activate them. There's a single button for context sensitive looking at things as well.
Yeah.
So
pretty streamlined. Did you listen to the radio or watch the TV at all?
I did both of those things. I didn't listen to the radio as much because I had already watched the whole loop of the TV, which is also peppering in stuff that's going to come up in the game.
Stuff. And because the whole, as we're talking about, the whole concept of Vampire the Masquerade is obviously that the vampires live among us, and so it's this very cool concept of who is a as a player you're thinking who is a vampire and who's not. So there's, for instance, in one of the news reports, they like a famous actor got into a car crash and miraculously survived, and so you're like, well, that guy's a vampire, it's like, so it's like the Tom Cruise of that world or something.
Right, yeah.
Which works on
the Church of Scientology guy,
and he was also in Interview with the Vampire, right? So
he was, and
I listened to the radio far longer than I probably should have, and never found the loop. So
oh, nice.
Yeah, so there's a lot of fun fictional ads in there, GTA style. So
anyway. I did really like that the TV. So the other thing that happens, like they mention how a body was found on the pier, which then you're actually going to go out and you're going to be near the pier. And if you go through the garage to get to the beach, you can actually overhear cops talking about that. So the world building continues, but yeah, like you point out, is like supporting this whole core fiction of like, yeah, there's vampires here and what's going on. One of them actually makes a joke, maybe it's a werewolf. When I walked up the stairs to the pier, you actually see a wolf, run along the horizon, which is actually beautifully done. Like it was very subtle, and I was actually, I have to say, so far I've been really impressed. I totally get, I've also seen some glitches, so I also know that about this game, right? That this is a game that historically is known to be pretty buggy, although we're both playing the unofficial patch. I assume you got it through GOG. Or Steam, actually. I don't know.
Steam. I got through Steam.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So there's a unofficial patch out there. I don't know how to apply it under Steam, but for me it was up to a certain point on GOG, and I was like, you know what, that's probably fine. This is years and years of fan patching. And it's been pretty stable, but there have been things where like there was a character who just like clearly teleported across, he like moved across my vision very quickly. I was like, that's not a vampire, that's just an NPC who's supposed to be somewhere else. And is being moved really quickly, but not instantaneously, because moving things instantaneously is bad for physics engines. So it's like you can see like all the 2004 problems when you see problems. It's pretty wild. So
yeah.
It's been very funny.
I mean, I'm actually the patch for the Steam version, at least the one that I got, it had its own installer. I mean, I was actually pretty impressed. It just,
oh yeah, they do that. Yeah, it's a whole thing.
So
it is pretty wild. Yeah,
and I'm excited. Probably we can do it more in depth maybe next time, but I'm excited to talk more about Santa Monica as a, they have kind of a hub structure, and as we talked about, it kind of reminds me structurally, level design wise, of Deus Ex in some ways, and so it'd be fun to talk about.
Yeah, we will dive into that, because we're and that's a good segue to talk about next time. We're gonna play up through downtown. I don't know how much time that is, so if it starts to feel excessive, just let me know and back off a little bit. But we're going to try to finish Santa Monica and play through the next major section, which is downtown. This all happens, I guess, around LA, which also makes sense considering where it's being developed. But it's so it's all around kind of Hollywood and LA, and it ends in Chinatown. I hope somebody at some point says, forget it, it's Chinatown. We'll see.
We'll see. We can, we can hope. So looking at the walkthrough kind of chunks, are we looking at a 5 session, do you think? Or is there...
I think, because it's Santa Monica, downtown, Hollywood, Chinatown, and then Endgame. Which who knows what that is? Like, I don't know how long that is. It's very difficult to tell. It might be a traditional sort of thing where, because this is actiony, like that might actually be pretty prolonged because it's a lot of combat, for example. I don't know. I'm just guessing.
So Endgame would be the 5th, you're saying?
Yeah, so I could see, I would say the Endgame would probably be the 5th, and we'll want to do takeaways and everything. So if that's shorter, that's also fine. But that's kind of how I've been thinking it would probably break out. And one or more of these chapters might be longer than I expect. So we'll just kind of, address that on our, through Twitter or whatever. But yeah, we will try to finish Santa Monica, which doesn't seem crazy huge. Although there is a lot of interconnectedness, like you've already pointed out, that I've already started to see, like, oh, this actually ties to that other thing. And
the level design density is seems quite good. So I'm excited to talk about that.
Yeah, for sure. So for next time, we will play up through downtown, which is the second sort of major chapter.
Downtown LA, my favorite place. Great.
Downtown.
Sorry, LA, but it's not my favorite place.
It's mine either. I'm not a huge LA guy myself. That's not my city. So I guess that's it for this week. We will be coming back to bite off more of this next time. We have neither reviews nor feedback in email, so we would love to have some. You can, of course, shoot us a review through the Apple Podcast or whatever other platform you use. I'm not dialed into those, so just send email and let me know where to find it, or we'll find it through the podcast app. I am still looking for that singing review from Aw Yeah, so send that in through email at devgameclub@gmail.com, where we also love to hear whatever you're thinking about what we've been playing and talking about, or your questions about game development, the games we're playing, the times we've lived through, or whatever else that you can think of. Throw it our way. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com or on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Wonga Jr. with a JR at the end.
I have suspended Twitch operations due to ongoing physical ailments. Who knows if that's ever coming back. I can't promise anything because now I'm having problems with my left arm and I'm not even doing as much anymore. finally, our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton and commissioned by friend of the cast, Aaron Evers. Thanks so much for finding the main vein this week, and good night.
Good night. Oh my God.
I got you.
Are you serious? The main vein.